Friends, welcome. Great to have you all here. This is In the Movement, and my name is Sam Heath. So I work with Equal Justice USA, and we're a national nonprofit, and we do work around death penalty repeal, restorative justice, and community safety. And this is our webinar series with the Evangelical Network. And so what we do here within the movement, meaning the justice movement, is we work to engage and elevate voices of people working within the work of justice. And what does it look like to love God's people and to be his hands and feet in the world? We talk here a lot about mass incarceration and what that is and how we live within a world that has this massive criminal legal system. And when we say mass incarceration, there's one piece that's really important. We speak about that as big, but it's also a symptom of something bigger that's going on. While we want to talk about justice and mass incarceration under the way that we function as a society, especially if we look at how we respond to violence, crime, or harm, our response is largely fear-based. And that's really poignant when we think about the most repeated command in Scripture being, do not fear. I also was looking at, again, 1 John 4 recently and how it's talking about perfect love casts out fear. And as Christians, we are people who are called to be fearless and to live in a world without fear of anyone or anything. And so we want to look at what does it look like to have people do things that are hard and weighty, still love those people. Sometimes those are us doing those things to others. How do we still live within a society rather than othering people, rather than putting them away for a long time or forever? How can we move and work towards restitution? So this webinar series looks at those things. So the Evangelical Network, we're here for a conversation about all of that. The specific topic today is we're looking at and thinking about reentry. What does it look like for people who've been in jail and prison to return home? So we'll use language of returning citizens, and we really want to think about what is the role of the church, both the church, big C, large global church, but also the church, smaller C, one local body, a parish. How can a group of people loving God weekly and throughout the week engage and love those who are in prison? Keeping in mind that often those within church are in prison or will be there as well. There's a lot of overlap that's there. So our guest today is Chris Hoke. And so Chris is coming from a group in Washington State called One Parish One Prisoner. And we're going to talk a lot about what they are. But Chris, if you just want to say a few words about who you are, and friend, I'm thankful you're here today.
Hey, thanks, Sam. Hi, everybody. My name is Chris Hoke. I am the founder and executive director of Underground Ministries. I've been working with gang-related folks and their reentry here in Washington for about 20 years. And One Parish, One Prisoner is our program to mobilize churches to join us.
Great. Chris, thank you. Thank you. We'll talk a lot about this. And what we'll also have, friends, at the end, as usual, we'll save about 10 to 15 minutes for some Q&A at the end of our time. So if you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A. You also can put them in the chat. And either way, we'll make sure to get to as many of those as we can at the end. If you like, it's always fun to see who all's here. You can put your name in the chat, a group, or if you're with a church, and then the city and state of where you are. I'll put all that in the chat. We'd love to just know where people are coming in from. There are a lot of people from all across the country and sometimes from outside of. So we're thankful that everybody is here. All right. A couple of things to frame our time. Again, we talk about mass incarceration, and there are a couple statistics and historical pieces we always want to remind ourselves of. And then there's some that are unique to what we're going to talk about today with Chris. The biggest thing and kind of the biggest proof of mass incarceration is remembering this. The United States has 4% of the world's population, and yet about 20% of people who are prisoners globally. So we already see a huge offset. Within the United States, we incarcerate at a rate that is astronomical compared to other countries and other civilizations. We've got now just under 2 million people who are within prison. Now, that's up from in the early 70s when it was about 300,000, and the peak was about 2.3 million, just a few years ago. Don't forget, though, about the 3.7 million people on probation or parole, and those are going to include a lot of the people we'll talk about with One Parish, One Prisoner today. There's about 5,000 jails and prisons within this country, not counting 1,300 juvenile detention centers. We can talk about the death penalty. We do in other times. We'll just say a little bit. 23 states, remember, can practice the death penalty or have repealed the death penalty, leaving 27 that can still do that now. And keep in mind this too, as we think about some of the breakdown of those who are in prison, the United States has about a third of the world's female prisoners, and about 1 out of 50 kids has a parent who is within prison. And for those who are in prison, about 1 in 7 is serving life without parole. That's about 200,000 people or so. So this is a large group. 1 in 7 have a life sentence. So if we zero in on where Chris is and where this ministry began, it began with, Chris will probably share, a recognition of a fact. And that fact was that for every individual who's in prison in Washington state, there was about one church within that state. And so the thinking came, well, what if we started to match that and match communities that love Jesus with people coming out of prison and returning home? And how would that shape both that body of Christ, that person returning home, and how would that shaping eventually be really mutual? So, Chris, let's start there, kind of with that idea. Is that really kind of where things began with One Parish, One Prisoner, hearing that idea, but also know you were doing work kind of in and around that area already?
Yeah, so for about maybe before I heard that fact, I'd been accompanying a lot of my friends. I went to the Skagit County Jail years ago here in the Skagit Valley. It's about an hour north of Seattle. And I came to study liberation theology with a scholar working with migrant farm workers and guys in jail, and was gang members that I really was surprised we found each other in kinship. They called me pastor, and we became friends. And I wasn't an ordained pastor nor social worker. But after about 12 years of just giving my whole life over to these friendships and helping them come home, just really getting my friends home before I learned the word reentry, even
Mm.
before I learned about mass incarceration, before Michelle Alexander's book came out. I had a book come out around that season, and with the book, you get to travel around. And that's when I heard, as we were telling stories about our friendships and our stories, and someone coming home to live with me, that there was roughly the same amount of churches in Washington state as there were men and women in the Washington Department of Corrections. And it started to really stick with me.
Mm.
I thought it was kind of goofy at first. I thought it was just someone in an Episcopal parish gave it to me. They said they called it One Parish One Prisoner. I didn't even come up with a name. But as my friend and I was home from prison, we went to a conference in Tennessee, in Nashville, which is, are you close to Vanderbilt right now, Sam?
I'm in Johnson City right now.
Okay.
Yeah, that's friends. That's why my background's a little off. I love having my books back here. I would have pointed to the new Jim Crow when Chris mentioned it, but I'm upstairs in a bedroom surrounded by stuffed dinosaurs right now.
Yeah, so 2015, my book came out, Just Mercy came out. I hadn't even heard
What's
of
the
Brian
title of
Stevenson,
your
but
book, Chris?
as
I want to make sure people know that too, the title. Or even better, and I'll send out a link to this, friends, too. But I want to make sure that people hear the title of what that is.
this is my book. It's called Wanted.
Okay.
And Brian Stevenson's talk, the first point, he talked about the power of proximity, and it felt like going to a poetry reading, like he was giving me language with what had happened in my life.
Wow.
Like there's when I went into a facility and met folks, it was not like I'd gone to UC Berkeley, so I was already kind of justice oriented,
Mm.
activist oriented. But I was surprised when I went into a facility, a much more generative power of friendship and human connection mobilized my life. And so when I started thinking about this One Parish, One Prisoner kind of goofy idea that a parishioner told me about, and then Michelle Alexander at the next plenary and keynote was talking about we need an underground railroad today, I started thinking maybe there's something to this. And so that was the beginning.
Wow. I know some of the language that you have is asking this question: what if every church became a local reentry team, a resurrection community, walking alongside just one neighbor, leaving the tombs of incarceration? We could spend the rest of the time on the language within that phrase, because there's so much I know that's intentional in there, of this idea of resurrection, of walking alongside, the idea of neighbor. We talk about so much here in the Evangelical Network, and the idea of tombs. And maybe let's start there, kind of where some of
Yeah.
these men and women are beginning. I was just writing to someone on death row who's in Oklahoma, and he was talking to me about how where he is, and this isn't unique to Oklahoma, they speak of it as the tombs. And
Mhm.
that's biblical too. Every time that prison and jail is spoken of within scripture, it's always something that's negative, and it's often equated with tombs, with death, with darkness. So let's start there. I mean, how did you start encountering people within these tombs, and what was that experience like?
Well, I mean, as I said, doing like a dialogical Bible studies in a small county jail, and then going into that system, and those friendships, when they got out, they led me to kind of the language I'd used for a while as just, I don't know, I always liked punk rock and underground music in Seattle. So like I always use the language of underground, but truly like the underground of this agricultural valley, which has a lot of pretty tulips and
Mhm.
salmon and evergreen trees. But they took me into the world of gang meetings and homelessness. and migrant camps and DSHS services and court systems. But then a lot of guys weren't released from county jail. They were sentenced to a lot of years in prison. And so they were shipped off to these, I started to feel like they were distant human landfills. They weren't correction centers. They were just human burial sites across the state. And I'd spent time in prisons, MS-13 and Barrio 18 prisons in Guatemala and El Salvador. And it felt just a slightly higher tech version of the same idea. And so at the same time, I was really falling in love with a lot of Orthodox theology, because I was just not finding myself at home with very much reformed ideas of like a warden God that's kind of normalizes suffering and punishment as like a spiritual and cosmic story. But like I have an icon here. This is really central for me. The early church icon of the resurrection isn't just like an Easter morning story of Jesus kind of like being a lone ranger coming out of the tombs, but it's a cosmic vision of the gates of Hades being shattered and the whole underground world, which is full of locks and keys, being shattered. And there's like a communion of resurrection. There's like a raising of the dead. This is the narrative for salvation of Orthodox Church. So I'd already been thinking about the gates of Hades and the underworld. And it just became really, really clear that, oh, United States mass incarceration system is just the most largest and contemporary manifestation of Hades, of social death that Jesus' whole ministry was undoing.
Yeah. I mean, I think about when Jesus was asked to read at the temple, he reads from Isaiah, and the passage he reads there within his ministry is about setting the captives free, proclaiming liberty. And there's a part of that that is, of course, spiritual, right? He's setting people free from Satan, sin, and death. But there's a piece of that that's real, that takes place here, that people are released from bondage in any form, however that manifests itself. And again, when scripture talks about jail and prison, it's always something that's negative. So there is this release of Jesus coming to break people free of bondage in whatever sense that looks like.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad to see that she's on here. Hannah Bauman with Christians for Abolition. We found each other online a few years ago, and it was really neat to see her interview with Mason Menega. That, like Brian Stevenson, felt like she was speaking the language that I'd been kind of living in for years. That we as Christians, even though it's been hijacked by kind of like a Western European and then American, I think, perversion of the faith, worshiping a warden God, we really, the whole New Testament is really an abolitionist worldview, the entire biblical narrative. And so to kind of reclaim like the spiritual blueprint for an abolitionist movement imagination has been really exciting for me.
It's a great word and it's a big word. And I didn't notice that. I'm glad you said that Hannah's on here. I mean, I've talked with her about that idea of abolition, and many have said this because it's so important, right? Abolition is not just about what you're ending. It's about what you're building, what you're bringing into this world, and what you're pointing people to, right? I mean, and then that's the gospel story. It's not only about the defeat of Satan, sin, and death. It is about this kingdom that is being brought. So, I mean, abolition at its best is about how are we bringing people into a new world, a new imagination of things?
Yeah, I brought a quote here that I've really been sticking on my wall that I think is part of that. I mean, on one hand, folks who have been studying abolition probably know Mariam Kaba. And she's the first one to say exactly what you just said, Sam, that this isn't about just, well, let's just tear down prisons because they're bad. Of course they're bad, but we've relied on a system of human disposal because we've given up on local relationships and local ways of valuing those who are most vulnerable, those who are most wounded. And so it's about creating the world that we want to live in and divesting from the kind of the hope that just reforming the death box and making it more comfortable will set us free. But so Ilya DeLeo, this theologian, says the Hebrew word for create, bara, means to bring into relationship. And so I think to create the world that we want as abolitionists, it's got to always be back to relationships, not just systems and ideas. So One Parish One Prisoner, we messed around with one or two. We had a big Jesuit church in downtown Seattle, a tiny Methodist church in the rural farmlands, kind of like a mid-sized Presbyterian suburban church where I'm inside right now. I've kind of been jumped in by the Presbyterians. These were like our 3 pilots, and we learned a lot. But now we have 62 teams and parishes launched in Washington State, and it keeps bringing me back out of my head and all the books I'm reading and integrating it with all these relationships where I'm seeing folks in prison delight in and be delighted in by all sorts of folks that would be freaked out by the word abolition. They've never
Yeah.
seen a documentary on mass incarceration, but
Mm.
all of a sudden they're pissed at the Department of Corrections because they want their friend home.
Yeah. I mean, 1 in 100 is about what it is for those that are locked up within the United States. So there's proximity, whether we know it or not, of people that we encounter. I also
Mhm.
see somebody in the chat quoted Ruthie Wilson Gilmore about abolition not being absence and its presence. Yeah, we're all just paraphrasing that idea. But I love how at its core, that's the coming of the kingdom. And so much of that is in my head now. I'm in season 2 of The Chosen, and they're talking about the kingdom, right? And Jesus is ushering in this thing. He's not just removing things, he is bringing in his very presence that's here. And you talked about proximity, and often we don't know, see, or care without that proximity. Brian
Mhm.
Stevenson talks about this. Michelle Warren's book is called The Power of Proximity. And there's this power within it in a lot of ways. One, there's power in that if we have proximity to those in need, our neighbors, we see that need, we feel that, we empathize. But also, it gives us power increasingly to help change that because we know and we've seen and we're now changed by it and we can't unsee what it is. So much of my own learning and changing over the past 15 plus years is seeing and hearing so many of these things. And at one point I said to my wife, I can't unsee these things now and I can't live now in a way that's not in light of all of this because now I know. And scripture talks about being awake. So there's an aspect of that too. But it begins with that proximity that a lot of people just don't have.
Yes.
And it has to be
Yeah.
on purpose, right?
Yeah.
So oh, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Sam.
No, just there's an intentionality that's there, especially if we're talking about evangelical Christians, and obviously, especially if we're talking about white Christians, that proximity to mass incarceration sometimes isn't naturally there. And someone has to find a way to do it. But again, 1 out of 100, like somebody who's in jail or prison or will be at some point, if it's not yourself. So we're never that far from it if we really pay attention and see our neighbors around us.
That's it. Yeah, I don't know if now is a good time or later on. I want to talk about something we're doing called the Lazarus Inventory or Lazarus Challenge that's helping us move One Parish One Prisoner beyond a lot of our like regional organizing and helping any church anywhere, anyone who's listening here today, whether our organizing is coming to your state soon, like we're expanding in Chicago and in South Texas this year, that we have, and Dexter, you can put in the chat if you can, one of my colleagues. He's a Presbyterian pastor who did One Parish One Prisoner. Now he's a church mobilizer with us.
We were on a meeting together with him, right?
Yeah,
I'm,
Dexter's the
I'm
coolest.
I met Dexter. Thanks for the Gilmore quote, Dexter. Great.
So the idea with our Lazarus inventory is actually how our very first One Parish One Prisoner church began. I was just preaching on Lazarus, which we can talk about. That's kind of our narrative schema for relationship, rolling away structural barriers, unbinding one another, approaching the tombs, community participation in resurrection as a practice.
Mm-hmm.
I was just preaching on this, and then it's a tiny enough Methodist church that someone could just shout out and say, "How do we start?" And I was like, "It's an idea. We don't have a program." This was like 8 years ago, and they said, "Well, we want to do it still." And I said, "Okay, raise your hand if you know someone in prison." And half the hands went up, and everyone turned around and they were surprised because they thought this was a private relationship they had. And they did basically what we did was a very quick inventory of relationships we have existing with people in the tombs. And most people don't talk about it. Everywhere we go and we preach, there's always, we have a table and people sign up for a newsletter to donate or to buy a book or a t-shirt or something. And there's always one or two people that linger. And then once the narthex is cleared out and the pastor's on their way out, someone kind of leans in quietly and starts talking about their son, their daughter, their neighbor, their nephew. And we have this long conversation. By the end, we always say, "How is your church coming around you? What's that?" And oh, nobody knows about this.
Yeah.
So we're not only seeing that as a problem, of shame, but it's also an opportunity that I think there's Lazarus relationships in every church everywhere, that if we can
Mm-hmm.
mobilize churches to go around and raise their hands and reduce the stigma and shame, I think there's a lot of, instead of like, well, let's have One Parish One Prisoner Paris, with people from this other planet called prison. I think there's a lot of learning that happens instantly, like, oh, our own community is affected by this.
Yeah.
So that's something we can talk about as a strategy, but all
Yeah.
to support exactly what you're saying. It affects everyone, and it's just those relationships are hidden and buried.
Which is so hard, especially 95% of people within prison come out, right? So these individuals that society has placed in, will be here, will be our neighbors, already are our neighbors. And again, it could be us, right? It's not just people who are guilty who go within jail and prison. So there's a lot of proximity there, and there is a lot of shame. And a lot of that's on purpose, right? I mean, our society has intentionally othered those people. I mean, you're using that phrase of tombs. And if we think about prisons, a lot of prisons are not in the center of downtown. They're out in
Mm.
the country. They take a drive to get to. They're surrounded by farms, and they're not something that's immediately visible and immediately within our mind. And the services for those individuals are hard to find, really particular, and again, not forefronted within society. So just the way that the civic sphere is constructed on purpose has othered those people and made those of us who've not been within prison feel better. And we shouldn't, because we aren't. Within that
That's it.
phrase, you talked about tombs, you talked about a resurrection community. Why that language of resurrection paired with that church community that people are entering into?
I mean, starting to see like, I mean, I've been messing around with the words like a spiritual cartography, like
Mm,
having the map of tombs in community. City planning theorists like Mike Davis in LA have done some work on this. With the Bible, it's just so exciting seeing as not hell as some like terrible Calvinist afterlife threat for compliance to a cop God, but as a map of what we do, that we bury the dead
mm,
and we remove people. And Orlando Patterson talks about social death in America and slavery and disenfranchisement being part of that. It's been really exciting to see resurrection not as a pastel Easter song, but as the undoing, as a really divine radical movement of undoing our systems, of putting humans into death spheres. And so the story of Lazarus, I just had to preach on what, like maybe 15 years ago. I still had hair. And I like metaphors, so it was really fun to start thinking about rolling away the stones as the heavy structural barriers that I was doing a lot. I didn't want to do social work, but when you love someone, you
mm,
figure it out. If your loved one is caught up in incarceration, some of the best social workers in America are just like mothers and fathers and baby mamas and baby daddies of people who are locked up,
mhm.
dealing with terribly arcane systems of driver's licenses and holds on driver's licenses and legal financial obligations and
Yeah.
finding housing and complying with parole officers and community custom. It's really, really tricky. But so just that language of rolling away stones, and then it just became endlessly beautiful. This story of Jesus not just resurrecting him as himself on the Easter story, but inviting a community to approach the tombs, to enter into weeping, to rolling away heavy structures, and then drawing even closer and undoing like the death clothing, the grave clothes of Lazarus, which seemed like such a contemplative image.
Mhm.
Like it's not about changing Lazarus. There's so much language, I think well-intentioned, but not helpful, about people coming home from prison or out of addiction or out of gangs. It's like, well, change. And one of my friends, Alex, who's now on staff with us, he's like, bro, I never changed. I just had a lot of shit I was dealing with in trauma. And so a lot of my healing is letting go of my gang identity and my defensive mechanisms to see who I've always been. And that's what
Mm,
Thompson's been talking about, like the true
yeah.
self. So I just
Wow.
love this idea of people unbinding Lazarus, and then what's not in the Lazarus story, but I see all the time, is church folks in the community are unbound as well from their own maybe shinier death clothes, so to say, their fake smile that I'm okay, my family's great, I'm upwardly mobile. And a
Mhm,
lot of folks are dealing with a lot of domestic violence, mental health struggles,
mhm,
death and grief in their homes and in churches, and abuse. And they find a communion to be unbound by the authenticity and the permission given by their friend home from prison.
mm,
So all of this as like a resurrection community is really exciting to me, because I kind of dropped out of churches as like a Sunday morning social club that had a few songs about Jesus. Because I grew up as a little evangelical kid raising my hand. Do you want to follow Jesus? I was like, hell yeah, this seems awesome.
mhm,
And then I realized churches were used follow Jesus as maybe just code for be a good church kid.
mhm.
And so the idea of churches being resurrection communities
Mm.
has turned me back towards thousands of little Christian social clubs and seeing how they're just a few steps away from becoming a resurrection community.
You use the language of identity and sense of self. And I was just yesterday talking with some colleagues about how so much of this work, when we engage, especially Christians, about these things, about the criminal legal system and the history of white supremacy in America and all of that, it pushes on people's identities, which is okay. But if you push on an identity, if you change it or if you challenge it, you always have to either offer a new one or remind someone of what identity is already there. And I'm thinking about recently trying to describe to my children about being an image bearer. And we were talking about being kind to everyone, that everyone is owed that just baseline as an image bearer of God. And then there are those that are children of God. And that's the identity that's there that doesn't change based off of what we do. And I say this to my kids because I need to hear it often, that we love you not because of what you do, but because of who or whose you are. And there's that reminder. And it takes a community to do that. Earlier this week, we had a summit here where I live, which is in Charlottesville. And we were talking about one of the three biggest needs for someone coming out of prison, along with a job and a place to stay, is a community to help facilitate and mediate all of those other things around it. So I want to get really practical and would love to hear some of these logistics. So you
Yeah.
talk about a local reentry team within a
Mhm.
church. Kind of what does that team look like? And what's the timeline for pairing that group with somebody who's within prison?
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun to kind of tinker with like prototyping how this actually works.
Hmm.
Going from the vague idea of one parish, one prisoner to what does it look like? We understood early on that you can't. My friends in prison were like, I can't have a relationship with the entire church while I'm locked up, like writing letters and building a trusting relationship. So we thought, okay, what about five people, like five fingers of a hand connected to the body, but to establish contact? And that went well for a while, but over 2 years, which is how kind of like we have 24 monthly learning modules that begin about a year before the release. And Dexter and I can share a little bit about just all the logistics of how we recruit parishes and how we get applications from across the state and open up conversations within all sorts of denominational networks. But the whole idea is that we have a church. I develop a team, which is now 7 to 10 people, because over the journey, normally one or two people kind of get busy or fall off, something happens, and that there's a lot of work to do for just 3 people. So we said 7 to 10 people. They commit to meeting once a month and reading one of the monthly learning modules that begins with the lost art of letter writing and goes all the way through trauma, healing, what is trust, getting through this terrible system that's going to piss you off. Let's give language to this. This is the gates of Hades. You're entering the realm of the dead. And it's designed to keep us out. And so
If it's hard,
um,
there's a reason.
yeah. And so we've got all these monthly learning modules to deal with everything from like relationships, power dynamics. We're doing a lot more with helping white churches really early on undo the assumptions that we've inherited in white saviorism.
Mhm.
Normally, it's not an individual that thinks they're a savior. We're just raised into, we have all this privilege and we need to go save people. So kind of helping people undo that and enter into mutuality, into um, in dialogue with their friend coming home, creating a reentry plan that's holistic, to mobilizing the church to fundraise, to pay off fines, pay off a few months of rent, welcoming the person home, walking them through the first 2 months of really acute reentry needs, and then walking through another year of employment, friendship, community integration, undoing assumptions about mass incarceration, and thinking how their church might move forward from there. That we're all learning a new way.
Mhm.
That's kind of the arc of the 2 year journey, with 24 monthly learning modules online. Um, yeah, so there's some of the logistics. Where you want to go from there?
Well, how do you mitigate the idea of we're outside, we have the power, the privilege, and we're coming to help and to save this individual? Kind of is there a moment when people realize like we're being shaped by this person too? Like we are now all part of a community. It's not just us always giving, that they're receiving things and learning as well. Kind of how do you design for that, or how have you seen that piece develop too?
Yeah, I mean, it always happened organically, just like we're
Mm,
if you're talking about the power of proximity, like just those friendships in the jail helped disarm me of
hmm
just really lousy narratives. But it became more and more clear in our learning modules. And Father Greg Boyle's book, Tattoos on the Heart, is just exquisite if anyone hasn't read it. He's really a stand-up comedian and a mystic and a saint, giving language to mutuality and savoring folks, not saving them.
Mhm.
And the whole goal is kinship, where us versus them disappears and it's just us. But we're now putting it even more in our website, onboarding materials, our kickoff orientation, that really I've noticed that churches brace a little bit with fear when we talk in a kind of like correcting tone about white saviorism.
Mhm.
Um, but when it's framed like, hey, the pressure's off, you don't have to save anyone. A lot of white folks, it's a shitty narrative that
Mm.
like individual white folks like myself, it's like, oh, phew, I don't have the answers. I hate pretending like I have my stuff together and I know how to save. I don't.
Yeah.
Like, I'm really depressed and um, trying to figure my shit out too. Even though I haven't been in prison, I'm not oppressed. I'm kind of messy inside. And so
Mm.
letting folks know the pressure's off,
Mm.
our modules are going to guide you to figuring this out together. And mutuality is the key.
Mm.
And the Lazarus story is really helpful because that team doesn't save Lazarus.
Mhm.
Jesus is the kind of divine author on
Yeah.
ground level, directing something that is not only bringing out Lazarus, but um, restoring and involving the community, inviting them out of their um, inviting them out of their
Bondage,
fear.
right?
Yeah, like I used to say a lot, like we're not trying to get people out of prison into churches. Like church, the ecclesia is the movement. And the
Mm.
movement that Jesus founded invites people out of both the tombs and the temple. And
Mhm.
so when people are both getting out of the temple structure as a metaphor, out of church religious place of worship as a definition of religion, and out of prisons as we exit both of those and come together, that's the ecclesia, that's the movement. But a lot
Mhm.
of folks, I'm surprised by how moved they are and ready for that. I thought there'd be a lot more resistance.
Mm. I mean, I can only just think that people have been living with such a lack of that, that there's a hunger for that and for something real when that's offered. But it's hard, right? I hear you saying, you said people kind of brace themselves for some of this, and they're in a way kind of understandably worried and reticent and unsure. How do you all walk through and choose how to narrate the history of mass incarceration and what that is? Because there's a piece of this I hear you saying, like there's an educational piece, there's a spiritual readiness, but there's also just like a baseline education of here's some things you've got to know about our country and our current system to be ready to enter into it. How have you all thought through and planned out kind of what those things are?
Yeah, it's interesting. Early on in some of those first three pilot churches, my friend who was home from prison, I was working really closely with for several years. I front loaded. I hadn't written a lot of modules or our program yet, but I was, here's the basics. Watch 13th,
Mm.
watch these documentaries. And my friend he was like, Chris, stop that shit. And I was like, what? They need to understand this. He's like, no, they don't, bro. And it really gave me pause. And he's just like, no, like you give a bunch of white folks some documentaries, that's all they're going to talk about. And they're not even going to write their one letter to their dude.
Mhm.
Like everything they're going to learn from, and he like, he just named, from Carlos, from Karina, from Kevin coming home. Like white people love to watch documentaries, but they will not pick up that letter and faithfully write every week, every month for years, the way you did with me, Chris. Get them to do that. And then
Yeah.
later on, they can watch some movies. But if you give them, if you think you got to give them the macro idea first, you're giving them a big distraction.
Mhm.
And so I still struggle with that. I want to frame people, but it's really
Yeah.
getting people into the incarnate relationship first, which is always harder.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. It's so hard. I think I'm a former teacher, and so much of what the way that I came into all of this with a capital T just was through hearing, here's what the history is. Because I didn't know, and I'm accountable for that, but I still didn't know. And as I was learning these things and teaching these things, I had to insert myself and find that proximity. But it was through here, it really was those relationships that then started to ignite so much of this. So I love that you're not thinking of this as some information to just download into somebody's head. This is and really begins with relationship. Though 13th is great, that relationship is key. Okay.
Yeah.
I see our friend also just came on. I want to say that for folks too, and feel free to introduce
Antonio,
them.
Hey, Chris, how are you?
hey, I'm good, man. Thanks for chiming in and joining us. This is my friend Antonio Gomez, and Antonio went through our journey of One Parish One Prisoner and worked with a congregation in Seattle. And Antonio, I don't know how much time you have right now. I know you're working your job at a drop-in center in Seattle, but I'm wondering if I can, or Sam and I can just throw some basic questions out for you to share a little bit of your experience.
Yeah, for sure, no problem. First of all, I really want to apologize for just coming in and dropping in and kind of interrupting the conversation you guys had going on. But
No, this
I
is
saw,
great, Antonio. I'm so glad you're here.
no, thank you.
So Antonio, why'd you, as you were a year or two from your release date, why did you take a risk on this weird idea of meeting with a bunch of normies in a church that are strangers to you to plan your reentry?
Man, honestly, Chris, like I've told you many times, man, in the beginning, I just saw it as just a blank piece of paper. Like, oh man, this is just something else, man, that ain't gonna go nowhere. And Armin, who was my cellmate at the time, um, he came back. He came back from church that evening and was like, "Here, man, this is for you. I got 30 years left, man. This is for you. You're gonna get out, and you're getting out soon, and you need to prepare yourself and make a plan." And I just saw it as an application. Send a picture, tell us about yourself, and I just thought nothing of it. And I left that application right there on the desk, and until Armin got back, Armin's words kind of encouraged me. Um, and he got me really thinking, like, at this time I had nothing. I didn't have no, my mom, the language barrier is just big. She till that day she couldn't even apply for visits because it's a process, or let alone set up an account for me to make collect calls. And so I would have to rely on others to be like, hey, help my mom. I can send her money from here, from my job that I get. And if it would take time, but it would happen if I was patient enough and when they would get to it. But what really inspired me to just fill that application, when Armin just said, look, man, you're gonna get out. You're gonna get out real soon. So you need to prepare yourself, and you have nothing to lose, he said. You really don't have anything to lose. We're right here. Like, you're nothing. If anything, you got more to gain. Like, you're gonna gain like something very special. Watch. And so I filled it out, man. I filled out every single. Yeah, I even sent a picture of my son and me in the visit, and it all just from there. A year later, I started hearing my name being called on mail call when they would bring the mails, and different people that I consider now like my Union family. Union is the place. Union Church is the place where my OPOP team came from.
Antonio, could you say a little bit about how folks on the team, and I think it's kind of a mixed church, but it's white majority, how they came alongside your existing family, with especially with your son and with the mother of your child and your family? How did they kind of like blend or build relationship as opposed to like trying to replace your family? How did that happen?
Well, after I told them about me, and about my past and my family, my son, um, they started asking in ways like, well, how can we help for your son, for you to see your son more? Can we help with rides? And at this point, there's only one person that could bring my son, that was authorized to bring him, who had like the parenting, like, it's this whole process and application and it gives people headaches, to those who are unfamiliar with the process. But Laura and Bill were willing to do it. Like, hey, if we can have, his mom notify this and saying, gives us and allow us to take your son, we'll bring your son every week, every visit. We'll alternate, we'll switch. And we'll bring your mom too. They were the first ones to. Bill was the first one to bring my mom after 8 years of being incarcerated, and all this whole time, she couldn't. Nobody would be willing to bring her, or she would get scared. Um, and so it was just they helped me kind of make that connection with my family behind bars. Like, they strengthened it to a point where it was just unreal to me, because it was just, I didn't even have to ask. When COVID hit and when the pandemic hit, they would like drop off groceries outside of my son's place. Water bottles, Gatorades. And they all said, they didn't even say, "Oh, this is from Union" or "This is from us." They were like, "No, this is from Antonio. Um, he wants you guys to get better. He wants Adrian to feel better." And those are ways that, and they always ask me, in what ways can we help? In what ways could we be there? In what ways can we help your presence be out here with your family? And so those are things that really has strengthened my connection with my family, with my family out here, with my mom and my sisters
Antonio,
and my son.
that's incredible. Just again, we talked about the intentionality with all of this. So what did it look like once you got out? How did that relationship change, and how was all of that mediated once you left and came home?
Oh man, it all went up from there, man, because my case wasn't you get 10-day early release and then you're gonna go to work release. I didn't even get to go to camp because I had an ice hold. I'm from El Salvador, so I had a ICE detainer. I had to go and get released from immigration or get deported. And so when I got released in 2022, March 24th, there was like 15 people including my family, but there was like 15 to 20 people outside of the prison with high hopes that immigration wouldn't show up and transfer me down to Tacoma. And so it was it was out in the rain and everything. But once I called them and said, "Hey, they're here to pick me up and it's immigration," they were like, it was sad, but they huddled up back together. Okay, what are we gonna do now? Now, how are we gonna walk along someone through an immigration process, an immigration proceeding? It's like, how do we do that? And they all put their heads together. And what was an incredible blessing to me, that one of my OPOP family members was an immigration attorney. Her name is Gretchen, and she kind of used her wisdom to kind of say, okay, this is what's gonna happen. This is what I've seen. This is what I've experienced with clients. And she kind of like, hey, when you get there, you call me. And she was the one who just held on to my hand, like through the immigration process and the detention center. And I spent like 150 days in isolation just because of the gang culture that was going on in the detention center. They didn't feel safe for others, and for my safety, they just kept me in isolation. But I never stopped getting cards that said, "Hey, we're praying for you," from 7-year-old kids that go to church and says, "Hey, we're praying for you. We can't wait for you to be out here. We'll be waiting for you, for praying for you, your family." And it's amazing how it all just went up from there. And then I went to Tacoma in March 24th, 2022, and I got released from there on September 6th of 2024 and they were outside waiting for me. There were like 4 people from OPOP, including my attorney, were just outside, and they just ran towards me. They ran towards me, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
And it was that's how that happened right there. And it was like $11,000 just for my court, and I didn't have that money at all, And Bill Hutchinson and his son were like, "Hey, we gotta raise money somehow. Let's do something." Like, so they got the word out. He and his son um did a bike trip. They were trying to do a bike trip all the way to the east side, and just kind of a fundraiser, and to whoever wanted donated it to donate to the bike ride. And I was like, "Yo, you guys are doing this for me. That's amazing. I have never felt that kind of love and support from people that I've just met through letters or over the phone or through a screen." And I'm like, "Yo, this is..." So that's just the tip of the iceberg with my experience with OPOP, man. And now I'm happy to call these guys my friends and my family. Bill Hutchinson, the main guy who was like the spokesman of our team out here, he's the one, when the judge said, "All right, man, say we don't deport you, and say we let you out here. You don't even have a job. You don't even have nowhere to stay. What are you gonna do?" But Bill's letter, once they read it, he's a handyman and he has a small business, and he's like, "Man, he has a place to stay. He has a job. He has clothes waiting for him. He's got all this. He's prepared. We got him. So he's set. If you allow him to be released from here, He's got a room, he's got clothes, he's got hygiene items. And he's gonna come work with me the next day that he gets released. And I was just like, I don't know. My mouth was just open, like in shock, like dang, like
Wow.
I didn't have to say one word. And then I was granted release. And it was a slim chance, but with the help of God, man, and the help of the people that God sent my way, and it all just came to be.
Wow.
And
Wow.
Sam, when hearing Antonio share more of the story that I've heard before, like what Bill Hutchinson did there, shout out to Bill if he sees this later, is like Bill was not a pastor. Bill was not trained in ministry leadership. He was just someone that the pastor said, hey, do you want to be on this team? And what Bill did, anyone can do. And
Anyone could do. He
churches
said,
are full of good-hearted folks who don't think they're qualified, quote, to do ministry, both in the activist sense and in the clergy sense. But when they have a basic map and a connection with one person, that friendship kind of informs and unlocks so much of our passions and our gifts to go the extra mile that a lot of nonprofits, I see them outworking a lot of nonprofit staff that we ally with.
right. And these people didn't even have the slightest idea of who they were. They just know that they went to church together, but they never went to each other's homes. They never had dinners together, anything like that. So to this day, they're like, hey, Antonio, man, thank you, because through this, you're an amazing blessing. And through you, we were able to put together a friendship with these folks from our church that we had no idea how much in common we have. And I was like, nah, man, you guys are the blessing in my life, So it goes forth, man, and it goes both ways when we both give it 100%, and
That's when you know it's
and
real. I love,
yeah,
I love hearing how this community came together around loving another person. And then to your point, then it is just this all around piece of this group caring for each other and everyone being mutually influenced and impacted and changed through all of this. So
right.
one, thank you for sharing all of that. That's incredible. And I also love that this story is beautiful and great and good, and also not unique. Like this is happening. Like this is possible. Like that
Yeah,
take special
very,
training or ordination, but you've got a process. And I think, Chris, you said you have a roadmap. Kind of here's the direction to move people in. And if people have that desire, then there's a way forward. So I want to remind people who are listening or watching, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat or in the Q&A. And I want to hear too. So you said you're expanding, right? I know into South Texas and Chicago and maybe looking at other places too. But for places that don't have One Parish, One Prisoner, what does it look like if a church wants to start to live and move in these ways? Chris? Like, how do you speak to them about what are some steps that they can take and move towards something like this? Because there's ways to do it that are really fast and they're and maybe foolish, and there's ways to your point of, well, we'll just read and study for a year, and you're gonna miss some people. So how do people balance that?
Yeah, well, yeah, for conservatives, it's it's fear and othering, and for liberals, it's just learn, head, and one day I'll be qualified. So yeah, proximity relationship with one person, that's our methodology. But Dexter put in the chat undergroundministries.org/Lazarus. And so we're going to be putting a lot more into building this onboarding ramp in. But I would invite you to click there, look at oneparishoneprisoner.org. That's our bigger kind of like vision and some stories and explanations. But this Lazarus link is helping churches do what I was describing a little bit ago about taking inventory creatively and liturgically as a part of worship, not just like a separate social work exploration on the side, but part of church during prayers to the people and responding, what are the Lazarus relationships we have? Sometimes, and I'm trusting and hoping that a lot of the times there are, as the stories I've told, there are people with a family member, a loved one, a neighbor, an ex who's locked up, and to bring that relationship to pastoral leadership and say, here's a place to start. But also there's so many churches that have someone that's involved in some kind of prison ministry. And you go to any conference on prison ministry, or you talk with anyone at church doing prison ministry, and it's only a few minutes before you hear, I just wish we had something for them when they got out. And so it's partnering with, so the Lazarus inventory can be going into deeper dialogue with someone in your faith community, your network, that goes into a local prison system and saying, do you have someone that's releasing into our county in the next couple of years that would be interested in this? And you can download our application. You can mail that into your friends, or either a group that goes into prison or an individual that you know, and they can send that to us, and we can already kind of help the onboarding and the exploration from there. But we're confident that helping churches kind of like locate those connections to the tombs locally will not be that hard. And then you just use our kind of like relationship and reentry 2-year roadmap for dummies, and magic happens.
Yeah. Yeah. Talk a little more about the expansion and why those particular places and what this looks like and kind of why go beyond Washington. Also, Antonio, I think I heard that you might be at work or anything. So if you've got to drop off, friend, you're free to do that, but also want to give you freedom to stay too.
Okay, no, thank you. I am at work right now. I'm a drop-in coordinator here at a nonprofit that we help the youth, unhoused youth. And so I just asked if I could be excused for a bit just to attend this meeting.
Okay, great.
Very thankful. I gotta get back to it.
Your thing, Antonio. Thank you for joining us.
Oh,
No,
yeah.
man, Chris, thank you.
So much.
Thank you.
Talk soon, bud.
Okay.
So it's a good question. Why expand? I mean, that's really the question at the heart of One Parish One Prisoner. I was fine just kind of like being the gang pastor in Skagit, but learning about the larger realities of mass incarceration and churches saying, we want to do this, is what drew me out of kind of our contented bubble and our specificity of place into the larger state. And just through conversations like this, with broader audiences, we've just been nudged and poked and prodded and invited by communities across the country saying, what does this look like? We're like, well, we'll figure that out in a few years. Folks in Chicago at Colby Jailhouse Ministries, they're like, look, don't push us off. They said to one of our staff members, Alvin, like, we do reentry in Cook County, Chicago, and it's like the largest county jail in America. And so we go in there, we're connected with the Seattle Archdiocese, so we have parishes all over. And our job is to find something for them to do to get involved in reentry, and we're not sure. And we've got all these folks that are now in IDOC, or Illinois Department of Corrections, saying they need reentry support beyond our tiny little house and staff. We've got parishes, we've got prisoners, we've got staff, let's rock. And so we were kind of quietly piloting some there, and we've got some support with Lilly, some Lilly funding for the next few years. And he said, we want to really intentionally go out to Chicago and see what this looks like. And the landscape in an urban setting, there's a lot more Black churches and Black neighborhoods that have been figuring out reentry for years. And so how do we, as a West Coast white and Latino staff organization, open up conversations, say, would this be helpful? How can we co-create what this might look like if you think it's helpful? And a lot of churches are saying, hell yeah. Texas is different, but
Texas is different in every way. Yeah. Shout out for people to keep in mind and pray for. Ramiro Gonzalez has an execution date, June 26th. He's a Christian on death row in Texas, and we're praying that he can survive and continue the ministry that he's doing there. Well, let me maybe move towards ending with this question. As churches move into this kind of work, Chris, and this kind of proximity, what do people need to be ready for?
Their hearts to be broken. That's our main thing in our kickoff orientation is oftentimes folks are afraid. And even before the kickoff orientation, like first pitching this to churches, like if folks are worried about safety, they're worried about the wrong kind of safety. We've launched 62 teams, not including the Chicago ones, and no one on any team or any church has had their home or church broken into. No one's had identity theft. No one's had even a pencil stolen, but everyone has had their hearts broken and their worldview rocked and their sense of comfort really put upside down. And so that's our main thing, is that we kind of see in that Lazarus story, right before Jesus says, roll away the stone, someone says, yeah, but what about the smell? And we kind of take that as a stand-in for all the what about this? What about that? And we love that Jesus doesn't say, you know, that's a good question. We're going to have like a stench mitigation committee work on that, and we'll come back and next. But I love that he also doesn't minimize it. Like, that's not important. He just says, did I not tell you if you do what I say, you'll see the glory of God?
Yeah.
And so for us, it's you're being asked to face a fear,
Mhm.
and your heart might be broken, but this is where the God that we're hungering for can start to move.
Mhm. I love that you're thinking about and redefining what safety is. And of course, a lot of us can't help but think about Aslan and Lion the Witch in the Wardrobe, and I think it was Mr. Beaver describing him by saying he's good but not safe. And that's real. We put ourselves at risk. I mean, again, I'll probably mention it next month. I'm watching The Chosen, and look what happens to all the disciples. Like, look at what happens within their lives, but yet look at how they're loving. Look at how they're changed. Look at how they're seeing and bringing the kingdom to these communities and building communities all around them. And again, with Antonio's story, which is beautiful and good and doesn't have to be unique. Like, as you said, like, here's some people, here's scripture, here's the spirit, and things happen. Wow.
That's it.
Well, Chris, I want to make sure people know any link that we've mentioned and stuff that you've put in the chat, I'm going to put in a follow-up email for people to get. So those of you that are here and you've all registered, I'll make sure you get a recording of this, all the links to these things, so you can follow up with and look more at One Parish, One Prisoner, and think about, what does this look like for your church community? How can you live out of proximity to those that are within jail and prison, and how can there be a shaping within everybody there?
Yeah, we'd love to work with the folks on this call, on this webinar, to figure out and work with you on the Lazarus inventory stuff. Like, what is it to find those connections and those relationships and put this journey together? We've got a team here that'd love to work with you.
Great. Great. I'm going to put in the chat here that next month on June 13th, we are going to continue this conversation. And so we're going to talk with Travis Claybrooks. He's with the Rafa Institute. They're a group that's in Nashville, Tennessee, and they do a lot of work to love a lot of people. And one piece of what they're doing is restorative justice work. Travis is a former police officer, and this group is thinking about, what does it look like to care for others, and how do we live in restorative ways? Rafa is the Hebrew word for to heal. And so they're thinking about exact things that you all are, Chris. How can we all experience healing? And what does that look like? Because we know the system doesn't do it. We know the system is not capable of it. Or if it happens within the system, it's often by accident. How do we do that intentionally? And how do we do that uniquely, and especially as Christians? And I love that you all are thinking about that within parishes, within churches, and calling them to be the hands and feet of Christ, which is what they are. So, Chris, blessings on your work. I know we're going to continue to overlap. I appreciate all that you're doing. Thankful and thrilled that you all are expanding, and want to make sure to direct a lot of people to you. But thanks for being here and sharing about your story so much.
This is a great forum. Thanks so much, Sam, for weaving worlds with all of us.
Yeah, absolutely. Friends, thanks for joining us. Again, I'll send an email soon so you can get all this information so you can follow up. But thanks, everyone, and blessings on your day. Bye-bye.